Halloween rapidly approaching, I thought I'd do a slightly themed show today about Halloween, but we'll come back to that in a moment. But before I start, let me remind you of something completely unconnected with Halloween. Those of you who might remember the Shrek movies may remember a scene in which Shrek, the hero of the story, and Donkey are suspended from chains in a dungeon, and the donkey is making loud exclamations that he has the right to remain silent, where Shrek eventually reminds him that although he has the right to remain silent, what he lacks is the capacity. Now, there's a similarity between this little comedy scene in the cartoon and Scotland's current predicament, which I'll come to just presently. But before I do that, let's talk about Kemi Badenoch, a woman with a mysteriously Scottish-sounding name. I always find it rather disconcerting when I hear that name. She was asked recently if the union with England and Scotland was actually truly voluntary. And of course, she said yes, it was, and Scotland was voluntarily in this union with England, and confirmed that we had the right to leave at any time we liked. Now, we all know this because this has been said so many times over the last 300 years that we have the right to leave. But like Donkey, we seem to lack the capacity to actually do this. In fact, it's not so much that we lack the capacity to do this, it's that we lack any kind of method for doing this. We know, because of international law and because the British government has confirmed it, in fact, Kemi Badenoch confirmed it herself, that we have the right to self-determination under international law. Now, this is a part of the United Nations structure for decolonisation, which emerged in the 1960s and which provoked the United Kingdom to tell the UN that Scotland was in a voluntary union. In other words, all the people of Scotland in 1707 decided unanimously that they wanted to be in a union with England, which is, of course, a complete fairy tale, a myth even bigger than the story of Shrek. However, to come back to the point, Ms. Badenoch, when challenged about the voluntary union or the voluntary nature of the union, found it easy enough to answer that. But if you asked her to explain how Scotland was going to be able to exercise this fabled right to self-determination, well, there was a lot of waffle and excuses, and nothing really seems to emerge from that. Now, the United Kingdom would like you to believe that the right to self-determination was exercised in 2014, when Alex Salmond organised a referendum and got the agreement of David Cameron through a thing called the Edinburgh Agreement, that the United Kingdom would respect the result of that referendum. However, there's something to bear in mind here, and that is that the United Kingdom, although it says it respects Scotland's right to self-determination, is actually perfectly, or seems perfectly comfortable with the idea of deciding that England will control whether or not that right is exercised. So it seems that when it comes to having the right to vote to leave the union, they're quite happy with that. But when it comes to actually A, holding a referendum, or B, honouring the result of it, it's very obvious that England regards that as being a subject of English law, not Scots law, or even international law. So it's a muddy area, and they like it to remain muddy, because then we don't actually know whether or not we would actually ever get independence if we voted yes. And it remains to be seen, and it's argued a lot by many commentators, whether the referendum in 2014, had we won it, would ever have resulted in England accepting that independence was going to take place and making sure that it actually did happen. Because at that point, they could just as easily have said, well, this referendum was not legally binding. Because it says that it's just an advisory referendum, and the agreement between Alex Salmond and David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, could be characterised by the English state as just a personal agreement, a gentleman's handshake, if you like, and just ignored it. So it's very obvious that we're not in a voluntary union at all. We have the right to leave it, but we're never going to be allowed to exercise that right. And that brings me to my next topic. And this is the bit where it's really, I suppose, in keeping with the theme of Halloween. I'm going to talk about spooks and ghosts, but not the type that you're thinking of, but more the type that the British government likes to have in Scotland, watching over us at all times. I've read a few articles recently. One recently passed to me by a friend who was, as he said to me way back in the midst of time, a member of a local authority. He was a member of staff in a local authority, and they used to get regular briefings from MI5, you know, the secret security organisation of the United Kingdom that everybody knows about. And their officers would come to local authorities to brief officers of those local authorities on so-called threats to the United Kingdom, how to recognise things like explosive devices, and how to monitor suspicious-looking people and so on. So it was obvious to anybody in these local authorities who were obviously sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act that there was something going on in Scotland all the time, and that the spooks, or the organisations tasked with the security of the UK, would be monitoring what went on here. But contrary to what you might imagine, after the threat from the IRA finally dissipated with the Northern Ireland peace agreement, the spooks really had to look at something else, and that something else was Scottish politics. And for a long time it's been evident, and this is hinted at in this communication I received recently, that there are people tasked in Scotland with watching what is going on inside Scottish political parties and other organisations, people who are not necessarily paid by the British state, but you never know, they might be. And their job is simply to watch what's going on and report back anything they think is significant or might pose a threat in some way to the integrity of the United Kingdom. So this is confirmation, if we needed it at all, that there are spooks inside political parties. And the conjecture here was that the smear attempt against Alex Salmond back in the day, when charges were brought against him and a major leak happened from the Scottish Government to the Unionist press, which led to a rash of lurid claims of misbehaviour on the part of Mr. Salmond at the time, and prejudiced his case, that leak came from just such a spook. Now, nobody knows exactly who the spooks are, and if I were to start naming names, I would probably end up in jail, because that has been termed to be perjury. Anybody mentioning any names that they know from Mr. Salmond's case is likely to get slapped in irons as soon as they say the words. So I'm not going to say the words. I don't think anybody in their right mind would want to put themselves in a situation where they could be jailed just for simply mentioning a name in connection with something which has happened. But that's the situation that we live in. So these spooks are there all of the time, and they're not necessarily secret agents. They're often people sympathetic to the United Kingdom cause, who have inveigled themselves into places not necessarily of power, but where they can influence the people who wield it. And I'm thinking of people like the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who has now been embroiled in her own, I suppose you could say, investigation into what went on with the £600,000 of public money that was raised to campaign for an independence referendum, which never happened. So it seems, if you look at all of the things that happened during Miss Sturgeon's administration, and the curious backtracking that went on at the point where we were meant to have a referendum in 2023, if you remember, in October, which never happened, and the subsequent and mysterious referral of the entire business of independence and holding referendums in Scotland to the English Supreme Court, which then ruled them illegal, and then Ms Sturgeon then promptly resigned as First Minister, and then the United Kingdom decided to have a go at her as well, that this is all part of the same general situation in Scotland of monitoring and undermining anybody perceived as a potential threat to the integrity of the so-called Union. So the question we now face is, how do we as Scottish people counter this surveillance state that we're living in? The answer to that is not an easy one, simply because we know that any organisations which form will be infiltrated with somebody who's going to monitor their activities at the highest level possible, not necessarily people who are elected to high office in these organisations, but those who may be just watching them in these meetings and reporting what is happening. So organisations like this of any kind, which purport to be supporting independence, are likely to have such people inside of them unbeknownst to everybody else. So how can we operate when we're being watched like this? This is reminiscent of the Cold War. This is reminiscent of the Soviet Union, where you would grass on your neighbor, grass on your friends, if they looked like they were in any way speaking up against the regime in charge. This is, I think, what you might call the velvet glove version of this, where you have an iron fist inside a velvet glove. In other words, the velvet glove is the United Kingdom, pretending that it's being all generous and nice to us and making sure we're all safe and happy, but inside there is an iron fist keeping the grip on what is going on here. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to remember that despite what we might think and what we might hear in the press, that such things don't happen here, they do happen here, and they've been happening here for a very, very long time. In fact, since 1950, at the earliest date that I can track them, these kinds of operations have been going on, and they'll continue until the United Kingdom thinks that Scotland is no longer a threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom. But it is worth remembering, as I've been pointing out for many years, and in fact Liberation Scotland, the organisation which formed as a public body containing all those people who want Scotland to be part of the rest of the world, not tied to an Anglo-British state. All of us who maybe are members of organisations like Liberation Scotland, making sure that anything weird that's happening with people that we know who are making, or shall we say, stirring things up inside such organisations and trying to persuade people that they're not being paranoid when they think that somebody's out to get them or that there is some kind of power struggle going on, that these things are spoken about, because these are exactly the sort of activities which are used in such soft security operations to provoke division inside organisations. However, having said all of that, it's a very difficult scenario to operate in. And I think the general thrust of everything that we do now has to be multi-headed. In other words, not have too many committees, not have leaders in which where there is an easy target for such activities to focus upon and discrediting them, but I have many, many leaders of many smaller groups. It's much more difficult for a spook organisation, if you want to call it that, to monitor hundreds of smaller groups than it is to monitor a handful of bigger ones. So I think that's the way we have to go. Split this up, divide and conquer in our own way by simply fragmenting into smaller organisations which are generally all moving in the same direction and which come together in bigger meetings every now and again to coordinate their activities. It's far harder for any spook organisation to split up groups like that when they are so numerous. Anyway, that's my Halloween themed programme for today. So just remember the Shrek quote, where Shrek said to Donkey he had the right to remain silent but lacked the capacity. Scotland has the right to self-determination but lacks a method, because the United Kingdom sees that as the domain of English law, which it is not. And this is why it's important for us to go outside of the United Kingdom to the international arbiters, such as the UN and the international courts, to establish that we have that right, so that the British state and its spooks cannot say that we have no right to do anything at all of the kind. Anyway, in the meantime, I hope you'll keep the faith, but remember, despite the fact that people say that these things don't happen, it's patently obvious that they do. It's very subtle. The British state is extremely skilled at this kind of activity, and it's extremely difficult for people like us to counter it. But I think it's important that we talk about it and we point out when things like this happen and who is being targeted and what they are being told, and how those people's perceptions of their own security are affected by some of these rumours and suggestions being whispered into their ears by people who are not friendly to Scotland at all. That's it from me today. As I've said many times before, please keep the faith, keep watching this programme, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye for now.